The wind in Dry Willow, Colorado, had a high, lonesome sound in the late spring of 1883. It carried the last chill of winter off the peaks, a cold that clung to the marrow of your bones long after the sun had climbed the sky. Patches of snow, stubborn as mules, hid in the rocky crevices and the north-facing shadows of the high country, feeding the creeks with a slow, begrudging trickle. Down in the valley, the wind found things to play with. It made the corrugated tin roof of the saloon hum like a poorly tuned guitar and worried the loose boards on fences until they groaned a constant, weary complaint. The town itself was little more than a single dusty street carved from the red earth. On one side stood the Silver Dollar Saloon, the post office, and the solid brick facade of the Pike & Company Bank. Across the street, as if in silent opposition, was the sheriff's office, its simple wooden sign creaking on its hinges. Out on the edge of town, where Willow Creek made a lazy bend, Eliza Rowe was mending one of those groaning fences. At 26, she was a widow, a title that felt as ill-fitting as her late husband's winter coat, which she sometimes wore for chores. The wind whipped strands of her brown hair loose from its severe bun, stinging her cheeks. She ignored it, her focus entirely on stretching a length of wire taut between two cedar posts. Her hands, chapped and calloused, worked with a practiced efficiency that belied the weariness in her shoulders. This land, this small homestead, was hers. Or rather, it was the bank's, and she was merely its keeper, locked in a slow, grinding battle against interest rates and the whims of the weather. Her goal was simple, monumental, and at times felt impossible to hold on. To keep the small herd of Hereford cattle her father had started, to tend the orchard of apricot trees he had planted, and to pay down the loan that had settled on this property like a permanent winter frost after his passing and her husband soon after. Every repaired fence, every calf born, every jar of preserves she put up was an act of defiance. She was not just surviving. She was staying. Across town, Sheriff Caleb Hart watched the dust devils dance down the street from the window of his office. He was a man in his 30s, with a stillness about him that people sometimes mistook for slowness. It was not. It was the careful economy of motion he had learned as a cavalryman, a life he had left behind, but that had left its mark on him in the straightness of his spine and the directness of his gaze. He believed in the law. He had to. It was the only fence, flimsy as it might be, that stood between order and the kind of chaos he had seen in the war. But he had no patience for bullies, and he knew the law could be twisted into a club as easily as it could be held up as a shield. His eyes drifted to the bank across the street. He had a feeling in his gut, the same kind of feeling he used to get before a skirmish, a low thrum of something not being right. Inside that bank, Silas Pike was also looking out a window, though his view was of the figures neatly entered in his ledger. Pike was a man whose civility was as polished and hard as the mahogany of his desk. He dressed in tailored suits from Denver. His salt and pepper hair was always perfectly combed, and he spoke with a gentle precision that could make a foreclosure sound like a favor. Beneath the surface, however, Pike was a pragmatist. He saw the world not in terms of people, but of assets, and the most valuable asset in this dry country was not gold or cattle, but water. He had studied the old survey maps. He knew that Willow Creek, the lifeblood of this end of the valley, cut directly through the Rowe homestead. Control of that land meant control of the water rights, and control of the water meant control of everything downstream. Eliza Rowe's stubbornness was not a personal affront. It was an obstacle to progress. His progress. The low thrum in Caleb's gut intensified when he saw Pike's man, a hired brute named Brigg, mount his horse and head out of town in the direction of the Rowe place. Brigg was a debt collector, a man who used his size and sour disposition as his primary tools of negotiation. Caleb took his hat from the peg by the door. He told his deputy, Earl Jensen, a soft, doughy man who always seemed to be nursing a complaint, to mind the office. He did not like where this was going. Eliza had just finished her section of fence when she heard the horse, Brigg did not bother with the gate, simply guiding his big roan over a low spot in the newly repaired line. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth, and walked toward her with the swagger of a man who owned any ground he stood on. "Ms. Rowe," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He held out a folded piece of paper. "From Mr. Pike." Eliza wiped her hands on her trousers. Her chin held high. She did not take the paper. If it's about the payment, it's not due for another 2 weeks. "You tell him I'll have it." "This ain't about that payment," Brigg grunted. "Enjoying himself. This is about the penalty interest. Says so right in your agreement. Payment's gotta be made in cash. In the bank, on the 1st of the month. You've been sending Tomas, the mail boy, over with drafts, sometimes on the 2nd, or the 3rd. He unfolded the paper with a dramatic flourish. "The board's met. They're calling the note due. This here's a foreclosure notice." The world seemed to tilt beneath Eliza's feet. Penalty interest. She had never heard of such a thing. Her father had made the deal. She had just kept paying, scrambling every month to have the money ready. "That's not right," she said, her voice thin but steady. "My father never agreed to that." Brigg shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference. He walked past her to the big barn, the heart of the homestead, its weathered gray wood a testament to a generation of labor. From his saddlebag, he produced a hammer and a nail. With 3 sharp, echoing blows, he affixed the document to the heavy barn door. Then, he took out a small canister and a stamp, pressing a bright, waxy red seal onto the paper. The color was a violent splash against the muted landscape, a mark of ownership, a brand. "Property of Pike & Company Bank," he announced to the wind and the nervous cattle. "You got 10 days to vacate." It was then that Sheriff Hart rode up, his arrival as quiet and deliberate as everything else about him. He did not dismount immediately. His eyes taking in the scene, Eliza standing stiff and pale as a ghost, Brigg with the hammer still in his hand, and the ugly red wound on the barn door. He swung down from his horse. "Brigg, what's the meaning of this?" Brigg gestured with his thumb. "Bank business, sheriff, all legal." Caleb walked over to the barn. Reading the notice, his jaw tightened. He turned to Eliza, his voice low and even. "Is this right?" "Eliza, the penalty clause." "I don't know anything about a penalty clause," she said, the words catching in her throat. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. "I have made every payment." Caleb looked from her face to Brigg's smug expression. "The law's the law," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But justice isn't a thing to be haggled over. This feels hasty." "I just need time." "Sheriff," Eliza said, her voice finding its strength again. It was a dry, hard sound, and one good rain. Just then, a buggy crested the rise, pulled by a handsome bay. Silas Pike himself had come to oversee the final transaction. He stepped down, brushing dust from his coat, his expression one of polite concern. "Eliza, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as creek water over polished stones. "I am so sorry it has come to this. Truly, a difficult business decision." "It's not business to me, Mr. Pike," she shot back. "It's my home." Of course, he soothed. "Which is why I have come to make you a proposition, to save you the unpleasantness of a public auction and the embarrassment of eviction. I am prepared to buy the land from you directly. I will cancel the remaining debt and give you a fair price for your trouble. Enough to see you settled comfortably somewhere else." The offer hung in the air, a baited hook disguised as a lifeline. Somewhere else. The words were a physical blow. There was no somewhere else. There was only here. The graves of her father and her husband were on the little hill overlooking the apricot trees. Her memories were soaked into the very soil. "No," she said, the word was small, but it was absolute. "The land is not for sale." Pike's smile tightened at the edges. "A foolish decision. Pride is a luxury you cannot afford." He turned to Caleb. "Sheriff, you are a witness to this. The bank has made every effort to be reasonable. Caleb's gaze was fixed on the foreclosure notice. I'd like to see the original loan agreement. Pike, the one her father signed. For a moment, Pike hesitated. Then, with a magnanimous gesture, he produced a file from his buggy. He handed the thick document to Caleb. By all means, you will find everything is in perfect order. Caleb took the papers, his thumb tracing the lines of ink. He saw Robert Rowe's familiar, florid signature at the bottom. Then he flipped to the addendum, the page detailing the penalty clause. The ink there seemed a shade darker, the handwriting of the clause itself a little more cramped, and the signature beneath it, while a decent imitation, was not quite right. The loop on the R was too tight. The cross on that was too low. It was a small thing, a detail most would overlook, but Caleb Hart was not most men. He did not say anything. He slowly folded the document and handed it back to Pike, his expression unreadable. But a seed had been planted. The law might be written in black and white, but he was beginning to suspect this contract was smeared with shades of gray. Pike, mistaking his silence for acceptance, gave a final, paternalistic nod to Eliza. 10 days, he said, before climbing back into his buggy and driving away, leaving Brig to follow on his horse. Eliza and Caleb were left alone in the sudden quiet, the wind whistling through the new wire on the fence. Eliza stared at the red seal on her barn, a brand that declared her a failure. She felt stripped bare, exposed. In the space of an afternoon, she had gone from a landowner to a tenant on borrowed time. The need to ask for help was a hot, bitter thing in her throat. But her pride was a wall she had built stone by stone, and she did not know how to tear it down. Caleb watched her, sensing the war within her. His duty was clear if the paperwork was valid. He would have to enforce it, but his conscience, that quiet, insistent voice, told him a different story. It told him to look closer, to question the ink, to stand for the person, not just the paper. The sun began to dip toward the mountains, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers reaching for the small homestead. The question hung in the cold spring air between the lawman and the widow. Was the law a thing of letters and seals? Or was it a thing of the heart appeared first on Gwendolyn Womack? The morning air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and distant pine. Caleb Hart rode out of Dry Willow before most of the town was awake. The memory of the flawed signature on Pike's document, a burr under his saddle. The county seat was a half-day's ride, a journey he made with a grim sense of purpose. The courthouse was a tired brick building that smelled of old paper and stale tobacco smoke. The county clerk, a man named Abernathy with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, regarded Caleb with weary patience. Looking for the Rowe file. Sheriff, Caleb said, keeping his voice casual. Just want to check the recorded copy of the mortgage. Abernathy grumbled, but he shuffled off into the archives. Returning minutes later with a heavy, string-bound ledger, he slapped it onto the counter, raising a small cloud of dust. All land claims since '75 are in there. Find it yourself. Caleb opened the book, the thick pages whispering as he turned them. He found the entry for the Rowe homestead, recorded 7 years prior. The terms were simple, the interest rate fair for the times. Robert Rowe's signature was there, bold and clear, witnessed by the clerk himself. But there was no addendum, no penalty clause. He flipped through the subsequent pages, checking for amendments. Nothing. Is this the only record you have? Caleb asked. That's the official one, Abernathy said, not looking up from his newspaper. Anything else is between the parties involved. Bank keeps their own copies, of course. Caleb persisted. Do you keep a register of notary seals used in your office? The clerk sighed, annoyed now. In the back, he gestured vaguely toward a dusty shelf. It took Caleb nearly an hour, but he found it, a logbook detailing every official stamp and seal pressed in the courthouse. He cross-referenced the date on Pike's addendum. There was a record. All right, A notary seal had been checked out on that day. 2 years after the original loan was signed, the signature in the log was faint, but unmistakable to a man who saw it every day on patrol reports. Deputy Earl Jensen. Caleb stared at the name until the letters blurred. He recalled the addendum Pike had shown him. The faint, almost invisible smudge on the edge of the waxy seal. A greasy fingerprint. He knew Earl had a habit of eating fried meat sandwiches at his desk. It all fit, a series of ugly, interlocking pieces. His own deputy was involved. Back at the homestead, Eliza was waging a different kind of war. The red seal on her barn door was a constant torment, a glaring symbol of her vulnerability. The world had shrunk to the boundaries of her land and the 10 days she had left to occupy it. The early dry spell had turned her pastures brittle and brown. The cattle, their ribs beginning to show, milled near the barn, their lowing a constant, mournful complaint. To make matters worse, the last windstorm had torn a sheet of tin from the barn roof, and the subsequent rain, a brief and mocking sprinkle, had ruined 2 sacks of precious grain. She felt a despair so profound it was like a physical weight on her chest, driven by a desperation that overrode her pride. She hitched her wagon and drove into town. She needed salt, flour, and coffee, but the few coins in her pocket would not cover it all. As she tied up the horse, May, the proprietor of the Silver Dollar Saloon, stepped out onto the boardwalk. May was a woman forged by hardship, with a face full of character and eyes that missed nothing. "Eliza," she said, her voice raspy from years of saloon air. "You look like you've been wrestling a ghost and lost." Eliza forced a thin smile. "Just the usual kind." "May." "Heard about Pike's move," May said, lowering her voice. "That man would foreclose on his own mother for $1. She looked Eliza up and down, taking in the frayed cuffs and the worry etched around her eyes. "Listen to me. I need fresh milk and butter for the saloon. My usual supplier's cow went dry. You provide for me, and I'll send a couple of my boys out to patch that roof of yours, and I'll see that your credit is good at the general store." The offer was a lifeline, but Eliza's pride recoiled. "I can't accept charity." "It is not charity, girl," May said sharply. "It is a business arrangement. You have something I need. I have something you need. That is how a community is supposed to work. Pike is spreading the word around town that you are a stubborn woman who will not be reasonable. Do not prove him right by being too proud to survive." The truth in May's words stung. Eliza swallowed hard and nodded. "All right, May, thank you." Her struggle was far from over. A few days later, a cattle buyer named Henderson, a man she had done business with before, came by. She needed to sell 2 steers to have cash for the next loan payment, assuming she could somehow stop the foreclosure. Henderson looked at the animals, his face a mask of professional disinterest, then looked everywhere but at Eliza. "I am sorry, Ms. Rowe," he mumbled, kicking at a loose stone. "Can't take them." "Can't take them," Eliza repeated, bewildered. "They're good stock. You know they are." "Market's down," he said, the lie thin and unconvincing. "Got no room?" He practically ran to his wagon, eager to escape. Eliza knew it was Pike. He was strangling her, cutting off every avenue, making it impossible for her to fight back. She was an island, and the water was rising. That evening, Caleb rode out to her homestead again. He found her by the creek, staring into the shallow, slow-moving water as if searching for an answer in the stones. "Henderson turned me down," she said without preamble, her voice flat. "Said the market was down." "I spoke with him," Caleb said quietly. "Pike threatened to call in his loans at the bank if he did business with you. He is trying to isolate you. Eliza, starve you out." She finally looked at him, her eyes flashing with a familiar fire. "Then he will have a fight on his hands." "Good," Caleb said, "because I believe you have one." He told her what he had found at the courthouse. He did not mention Earl's name. Not yet. He simply laid out the inconsistencies, the missing addendum in the official record, the suspicious timing. I think the penalty clause was added later. I think the signature was forged. A flicker of hope, fragile and tentative, sparked within her. But how can we prove it? That is where you come in, he said. We need to file a formal dispute with the circuit judge. If we do, I can legally seal the property as contested. It will put a stop to the eviction, at least for a while. It puts a fence around you that even Pike cannot cross without a court order. He paused, letting the words sink in. But in return, I need your help. You have to become my partner in this. I need you to write everything down. Every conversation, every threat, every person who refuses you service. Times, dates, names. We need a record. We need witnesses. You cannot do this with pride. Eliza, you have to do this with facts. She looked from his earnest face to the vast, indifferent landscape. To trust him, to trust the law that had so far been used as a weapon against her, felt like a leap into a canyon. But the alternative was to give up and walk away. And that was not in her nature. "All right, Sheriff," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I will do it." The cooperation began, reluctantly at first, then with a growing sense of shared purpose. That night, the wind rose, a wild, keening thing that howled down from the mountains. It rattled the windows of Eliza's small house and tore at the new patches on the barn roof. Sometime after midnight, she was jolted awake by a sound that made her blood run cold, the frantic, high-pitched yipping of coyotes, answered by the terrified bawling of a calf. She grabbed her father's old rifle and a lit lantern, her heart pounding against her ribs. One of her cows had given birth just 2 days before, and the calf was weak, vulnerable. She ran out into the roaring darkness, the lantern light dancing crazily, revealing fleeting glimpses of shadows darting at the edge of the herd. The cattle were bunched together, panicked, their eyes wide with terror. Just as she raised the rifle, another light appeared, a torch held high, bouncing as a horse galloped toward her. It was Caleb. He had been unable to sleep, a nagging worry for her safety pulling him back out to the homestead. He reined in his horse, vaulting from the saddle. "How many?" he yelled over the wind. "A whole pack," she shouted back. There was no time for discussion. He grabbed the torch from his saddle, a bundle of oil-soaked rags tied to a sturdy branch. "You take the east side, I will take the west. Keep them from scattering the herd." She nodded, her fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by the sharp clarity of action. She held the lantern high in one hand, the rifle in the other, and ran toward the far side of the pasture, her boots slipping on the uneven ground. The coyotes were cunning, feinting and darting, trying to separate the calf from its mother. The air was filled with their noise, the wind, and the pounding of her own blood in her ears. She saw a bold one, larger than the rest, lunge for the calf. Without thinking, she stopped, braced herself, and aimed the rifle just over its head, firing into the darkness. The crack of the shot was shockingly loud, and the coyote yelped, leaping back into the shadows. Across the field, Caleb was doing the same, his torch a moving circle of fire, his voice a low, commanding shout that seemed to push the darkness back. He was a steady presence in the chaos, a bulwark against the wildness of the night. They worked in a grim, unspoken rhythm, 2 small points of light and defiance against a tide of predators. At one point, as she reloaded, her hands clumsy with cold and adrenaline, she saw a pair of coyotes break away and circle toward her. "Mr. Hart," she called out, a note of dry humor creeping into her voice despite the danger. "Are you planning to arrest those coyotes with your law book?" He appeared at her side, his own torch casting their long shadows on the ground. He raised his pistol and fired a single shot into the air above their heads. The sound echoed, sharp and final. "I figure they are poor readers," he said, his mouth twisting into a faint smile. The bluff worked. The remaining coyotes, unnerved by the noise, the fire, and the 2 resolute humans who refused to back down, melted away into the night. Silence descended. broken only by the panting of the cattle and the dying whistle of the wind. They stood together in the aftermath, the smell of gunpowder and burnt pitch hanging in the air. Eliza's arms ached, and she was trembling, but the calf was safe, nudging against its mother's side. She looked at Caleb, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight. In the heat of the moment, he had not been the sheriff. He had been a partner, a man who had stood with her. Trust, she was beginning to learn, was not something you decided to have. It was something that was built, one small, brave action at a time, in the dark, in the wind. Caleb rode back to town as the first hint of dawn was graying the eastern sky. His mind was a churn of thoughts, the forged document, Earl's betrayal, Eliza's courage. As he passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, he saw a lamp burning in a back room. He slowed his horse, his eyes drawn to the window. Through the glass, he could see two figures at a table, their heads close together over a bottle of whiskey. One was Silas Pike, the other, his shoulders slumped in a way that was all too familiar, was Deputy Earl Jensen. The sight settled in Caleb's gut like a cold stone. The fight for Eliza's land had just become a fight for the soul of his own office, appeared first on Gwendolyn Womack. The sight of Earl Jensen sharing whiskey with Silas Pike had settled a cold certainty in Caleb Hart's soul. This was no longer just about a suspicious document. It was a conspiracy that reached into his own office. His investigation could not rely on the town's records alone, which he now suspected were compromised. He needed to understand the why. The true value of the Rowe homestead was the missing piece, and he had a hunch it had less to do with grazing land and more to do with the creek that ran through it. He rode back to the county seat, but this time he bypassed the clerk's office. He went to the land surveyor's archives, a cramped, musty room filled with rolled maps and geological surveys dating back to when Colorado was still a territory. He spent hours poring over topographical charts, his fingers tracing the blue line of Willow Creek as it snaked through the valley. On the most recent survey, the creek followed a predictable path, neatly bisecting Eliza's property, but in a much older, hand-drawn territorial map from the 1860s. He found what he was looking for. It was a faded notation in the margin, written in a spidery script, Spring Flood Oxbow. The cartographer had sketched a dotted line showing where the creek jumped its banks during the spring melt, carving a temporary, deeper channel in a wide arc. That arc, that oxbow, swung far wider than the current creek bed, encompassing nearly all of Eliza's prime pasture land before rejoining the main channel. According to territorial water law, the bedrock of all current legislation, rights followed the high water mark. Whoever owned the Rowe land did not just own a creek. During a flood, they owned the river. They would hold the primary irrigation rights for half the valley. Pike was not just trying to steal a homestead. He was orchestrating a quiet takeover of the entire region's water supply. While Caleb was uncovering the scope of Pike's ambition, Eliza was living its consequences. One evening, she found the stone cairns her father had built to mark the corners of their property systematically dismantled, the rocks scattered as if by a malevolent giant. It was a petty, unnerving act of violation, a message that her boundaries meant nothing. She spent the next day rebuilding them, her hands aching, her spirit grim. The true attack came 2 nights later. A strange smell woke her from a shallow, troubled sleep. It was not the familiar scent of hay and cattle, but something acrid and hungry. Smoke. She threw on her boots and ran outside. The sight stole the breath from her lungs. An angry orange glow pulsed from the far side of her hay barn. Flames were licking up the dry timber, greedily consuming the winter fodder she had worked so hard to put up. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her for a heartbeat. Then, instinct took over. Her cattle. They were in the main barn, adjacent to the burning hayrick. She sprinted toward the building, the heat of the fire a physical blow against her face. She could hear the terrified lowing of the animals inside, their fear a tangible thing in the smoky air. The heavy wooden bolt on the main gate was hot to the touch, but she did not hesitate, pulling it back with a desperate heave. A wave of heat washed over her, and she felt a sharp, searing pain across the back of her right hand, but she barely registered it. "Hey, get out, go on," she screamed, waving her arms, driving the panicked animals out into the open pasture. Away from the spreading flames, one by one they thundered out, their eyes wide and white in the firelight. She counted them as they passed, her mind a frantic ledger of her life's only assets. When the last one was clear, she stumbled back, choking on the thick smoke, her hand throbbing with a sudden, intense pain. She looked down and saw an angry red welt rising on her skin, a burn from the hot iron of the gate lock. The hay barn was a lost cause, a roaring inferno against the black velvet of the night sky. But her herd was safe. She leaned against a fence post, gasping for air, watching her livelihood go up in smoke. Caleb arrived as the flames began to die down. Having seen the glow from town, he found her there, wrapped in a blanket May had brought, her face smudged with soot, her eyes reflecting the dying embers. He examined the scene with a grim professionalism, his gaze missing nothing. He found a set of boot prints, large and deep, leading away from the barn. Near the prints, half hidden in the grass, was a half-burnt cheroot cigar, a brand he knew Silas Pike favored. It was not proof, but it was a trail. He rode back to town and went straight to the boarding house where Briggs stayed. He found the man snoring in his room, stinking of cheap whiskey. His boots, caked in fresh mud and soot, were on the floor by his bed. Caleb arrested him for arson. He marched Briggs into the sheriff's office, the satisfaction of the moment short-lived. Deputy Earl Jensen, who had been dozing at his desk, looked at the prisoner with a distinct lack of surprise. "What's the charge?" Earl asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Arson," Caleb said, his voice hard. "I found his tracks all over the scene." "Tracks ain't proof." "Sheriff," Earl said with a slow shake of his head, "could be anyone's boots. You got a witness saw him light the fire." "I have a good idea who paid him to—" Caleb bit back, his eyes boring into his deputy. "Ideas ain't evidence," Earl recited, as if reading from a book. "Unless you got something more." "I gotta let him go." Can't hold a man on a notion. The exchange was a sham, and they both knew it. Caleb felt a surge of cold fury, but his hands were tied. Earl was technically correct. Without a confession or a witness, he could not hold Briggs. He watched, his jaw clenched, as Earl unlocked the cell and Briggs walked out, a sneering grin on his face. The law, which Caleb had dedicated his life to, had just been used to set a guilty man free. He felt a profound sense of failure. The news of Briggs' release hit Eliza harder than the fire itself. The system she had placed her fragile trust in had betrayed her. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating. For a day, she did nothing, moving about her chores in a fog of despair. But as she stood on her porch, looking at the charred skeleton of her hay barn and the small, determined faces of her cattle, something shifted. The fear did not vanish, but it was consumed by a slow, burning anger. They had tried to burn her out, to scare her off. They thought she was a weak, defenseless woman. She would show them how wrong they were. She marched into town the next morning and went straight to Caleb's office. He looked up from his paperwork, his face haggard. "I want to sue him," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I want to take Silas Pike to court." Caleb studied her for a long moment. He saw the soot still faintly smudged on her cheek, the new resolve in her eyes. "It will cost you, Eliza, filing fees, a lawyer, money you need for seed and supplies." "What good is seed if I do not have the land to plant it in?" she countered. "He started this with paper. I will finish it with paper." A slow smile touched Caleb's lips. This was the woman who had faced down coyotes in the dark. "All right," he said, "we will do it." The days that followed were a blur of activity, with Caleb's guidance. Eliza filed the lawsuit. The official stamp on the document a small victory against the red seal on her barn. The legal action temporarily halted the eviction, but it did not stop the campaign of harassment. Her fences were cut twice more. One windswept afternoon, Caleb rode out with a bundle of wire and a post hole digger. He found her struggling to reset a corner post by herself. "Looks like you could use a hand," he said, dismounting. She did not protest. They worked together in a comfortable silence. The only sounds, the scrape of the shovel against the rocky soil and the whine of the wind. They were rebuilding a physical boundary, a clear line between what was hers and what was not, and the shared labor felt significant, a partnership forged in dirt and sweat. "It feels like every time I fix something," she said, wiping a dusty hand across her forehead, "he just finds a new way to break it." "That is why you build it stronger than it was before," Caleb replied, tamping the earth around the new post with his boot. He noticed her wincing as she stretched the wire. He stopped her, his voice gentle. "Let me see your hand." She hesitated, then held it out. The burn was still red and angry. He took her hand in his touch surprisingly soft for a man whose life was built on force. He examined the wound with a critical eye. "You need to keep this clean," he said, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment, the fence, the wind, the threat of Silas Pike all faded away. There was only the quiet space between them, a shared understanding of the fight they were in, and the unspoken acknowledgement of something more. He pulled a clean kerchief from his pocket and, with a careful touch, wrapped it around her hand, fashioning a loose bandage. "There," he said, his voice a little rough. "That should help." As they were gathering their tools, Caleb noticed a plank of wood near the foundation of the burned-out barn. It was a solid piece of sugar pine, singed at one end but otherwise smooth and unwarped. He picked it up, testing its weight. "Good, solid piece of wood," he remarked, a half-smile playing on his lips. He looked over at her small, bare porch, almost enough to build a porch swing. The idea was so unexpected, so rooted in a future she could not dare to imagine, that a small, genuine laugh escaped her lips. The sound was rusty, but real. "Let's see if I have a porch left to hang it from first." "Sheriff," she said, her wit a shield for the sudden welling of emotion in her chest. That night, a thought struck Eliza. She remembered her father, a meticulous man, spending hours in the evenings with ink and parchment. He had always been obsessed with the creek, talking about its true path and how it was the heart of their land. She had a sudden, vivid memory of him showing her a map he had drawn himself. The next day, she and Caleb went to the small community church. The Reverend Michael, a man with kind, watery eyes and a memory as long as the valley, listened to their story patiently. "Your father, Robert," the Reverend said, nodding slowly. "A good man. A man who believed in keeping records. He was a church elder. He left a number of his important papers with us for safekeeping, thinking the church was less likely to burn down than his own barn. He led them to a small, oak chest in the vestry. After a few minutes of searching, he pulled out a rolled piece of parchment, tied with a leather thong. He handed it to Eliza. With trembling fingers, she untied it and spread it out on the vestry table. It was a map of her homestead, drawn in her father's steady, familiar hand. And there, clearly marked in dark ink, was the creek, with a second, wider channel arcing through the property, labeled in his handwriting Willow Creek High Water Path, surveyed 1868. Caleb stared at the map, a sense of profound relief washing over him. It was not a legal document from the county, but it was something more powerful. It was a piece of history, a testament from the man who had first worked this land. It was a truth, drawn in ink, that had been waiting patiently in the quiet of the church for its moment to be told. Caleb Hart held the map Eliza's father had drawn, the parchment cool and dry beneath his fingers. It was a truth, but it was a homespun truth, and he knew Silas Pike would dismiss it in a court of law as the sentimental doodling of a dead man. He needed something official, something undeniable. He needed the piece that connected the forgery to the bank, and he was certain that piece was his own deputy. The image of Earl Jensen sharing a late-night bottle with Pike was seared into his mind, a constant, bitter reminder of the rot within his own office. His opportunity came from an unlikely source. He was having a midday meal at the Silver Dollar Saloon, a quiet affair of stew and stale bread. When May sat down opposite him, her expression grim. "Sheriff," she began, her voice a low rumble, "I am not one to carry tales, but something does not sit right with me. I keep late hours here. For the past month, on 2 separate occasions, I have seen your deputy, Earl, letting himself into Pike's bank long after it was closed for the night. No one else around, just him, a lamp, and a key." Caleb kept his face impassive, but May's words landed like hammer blows on the anvil of his suspicions. "You are certain it was him?" "As certain as I am that this stew needs more salt," she said flatly. "I know the slump of that man's shoulders anywhere. He looks like a man carrying a debt he cannot pay." That night, Caleb did not go home. He found a dark spot in the alleyway across from the Pike & Company Bank, a place that offered a clear view of the front door, and he waited. The hours crawled by. The moon rose, casting long, skeletal shadows down the empty street. The saloons emptied out, and a deep quiet settled over Dry Willow. Just when he was about to give up, convinced his vigil was a fool's errand, he saw it. A faint, flickering light appeared in the bank's rear window. He moved silently, his cavalry training serving him well. He crept around the back of the building, pressing himself flat against the brick wall. The window was high, but he found a stack of discarded crates and pulled himself up. He peered through the grimy glass. The scene inside was just as May had described. Earl Jensen stood at a tall clerk's desk, a single oil lamp casting his hunched shadow large against the far wall. Spread before him were papers and a heavy ledger book. In his hand, he held a notary's seal. As Caleb watched, Earl carefully heated a stick of red wax over the lamp's chimney, dripped a precise puddle onto a document, and then, with a furtive glance toward the darkened street, he pressed the seal into the wax. It was the linchpin, the final, damning piece of evidence. Caleb felt a cold, hard anger rise within him, but he pushed it down. He needed to play this carefully. He dropped back to the ground and walked around to the front of the bank. He took a deep breath and tried the door. Unlocked. Just as May had said. He stepped inside, his boots making no sound on the polished wooden floor. He was halfway to the back room when Earl heard him. The deputy's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic, his face pale and slick with sweat in the lamplight. He looked like a cornered animal. "Sheriff," he stammered, his hand instinctively trying to cover the papers on the desk. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question." "Earl," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. He let his gaze drift from Earl's terrified face to the notary seal on the desk, then to the open ledger. It was the county's official notary logbook, the one Caleb himself had consulted. It should have been locked in a safe at the courthouse. That is a long way from home for a county record. Earl visibly deflated, the fight going out of him in a rush. The shame was so palpable it seemed to fill the small room. "I can explain." "Then you had best start," Caleb said, stepping closer. He picked up the freshly stamped document. It was another addendum, for another poor soul who had fallen behind on their payments. Earl finally broke. The words came out in a torrent, a confession of a man drowning in his own mistakes. "It was Pike," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My wife. She got sick last winter. The doctor in Denver. It cost everything we had, and then some. Pike offered to cover the debt. He said it was a loan, a favor between friends. But it was not. He owned me." Earl explained how Pike had come to him with the plan. He wanted the Roe land, needed it for the water rights. The penalty clause was his invention, a way to legally steal the property. Earl's job was to make it official. He had used his access as a deputy to take the notary logbook from the courthouse. He had found a blank page at the back, carefully forged the entry for the Roe addendum, and then, using a heated knife, had skillfully removed the original blank page and replaced it with his forged one. The book now appeared complete, untampered with to a casual observer. What Caleb had seen tonight was Earl creating another fraudulent document for another of Pike's schemes. He told me if I did not do it, he would ruin me. Earl finished, his face buried in his hands. He would call in the note, take my house, my family would be on the street. Caleb listened, the anger in him slowly giving way to a weary sadness. Earl was a weak man, a foolish man, but he was not an evil one. He had been caught in a trap laid by a true predator. You broke the law. Earl, Caleb said, his voice firm but not without a sliver of compassion. You broke my trust, but Pike is the one who broke you. You have a choice to make. Right now, you can go down with him, or you can help me make this right. He laid out his proposal. Earl would write down everything he had just said in a full confession. He would detail every forgery, every secret meeting, every threat Pike had made. He would sign it, and Caleb would have it witnessed. In exchange, Caleb would speak for him to the circuit judge, arguing that he had acted under duress and had cooperated with the law. As this drama unfolded in the dead of night, Eliza Rowe was preparing for her own battle. The following day was Sunday. She had spent the week speaking with a handful of neighbors who had not yet turned their backs on her, showing them her father's map, explaining the injustice of the foreclosure. Their reactions were a mixture of sympathy, fear, and doubt. Taking on Silas Pike was like trying to fight a mountain. That Sunday morning, she walked into the small church and took her usual seat in the back pew. The building was full. The service was a comforting ritual. The familiar hymns and prayers a balm to her frayed nerves. When the Reverend Michael finished his sermon, he paused, looking out over his congregation. Before we conclude, he said, his kindly gaze landing on Eliza, I believe Eliza Rowe has something she would like to share with the community. A murmur went through the pews. All eyes turned to her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and her mouth went dry. This was it. She stood up, her legs trembling, and walked to the front of the church. She stood not at the pulpit, but before it, on the same level as her neighbors. She looked at their faces, a collection of people she had known her entire life. I am not here to ask for your pity, she began, her voice shaking slightly at first, then growing stronger. I am here to speak a truth. You all knew my father, Robert Rowe. You know he was an honest man. He worked our land his entire life. He built our home with his own hands. She paused, taking a deep breath. That land ate my father's sweat. It holds his bones. Now, Mr. Pike at the bank says I have not paid my debt, and he means to take it, but the paper he holds is not the paper my father signed. She looked directly at Silas Pike, who sat in the front pew, his face a mask of polite indignation. If Mr. Pike wants my land, she declared, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity and power, let him buy it with a true price, not with fire and false ink. A wave of whispers and shocked murmurs swept through the church. She had done it. She had made the accusation public, turning a private legal dispute into a matter of community honor. She walked back to her pew, her head held high, ignoring the stares and the gossip that erupted around her. She had spoken her truth. Now, the town would have to choose which story to believe. Pike was not a man to be challenged publicly. He was furious, his carefully constructed image of a civic benefactor shattered by the words of a stubborn widow. He moved quickly. The next day, a writer from the county seat brought a notice to Caleb's office. Silas Pike had filed an emergency petition with the circuit judge, citing the recent arson and the ongoing risk of fire due to what his petition called a poorly managed and hazardous property. He was requesting a temporary order of seizure. He was asking the court to grant him immediate temporary control of the Rowe homestead, in the interest of public safety. The document was a masterful piece of legal maneuvering, turning Eliza's victimhood into a weapon against her. It painted her as incompetent and her homestead as a threat to the entire valley. The judge, not knowing the full story, had set a hearing. A decision was pending. The order hung over them, a new and more dangerous threat, even with Earl's signed confession locked in his desk. Caleb knew that if Pike got legal control of that land, even for a day, he would never let it go. The law, which should have been Eliza's shield, was being twisted once again into a cage. Its bars closing in around her, appeared first on Gwendolyn Womack. The night before the hearing was heavy with a silence that felt different from the usual quiet of the high country. It was a waiting silence, full of unspoken fears. Eliza sat on the top step of her porch, the one that had not been badly charred, and stared out into the darkness. She had done everything she could. She had signed the legal papers, told her story to her neighbors, and stood up in church to speak her truth. Now, her fate was in the hands of a circuit judge who saw her only as a name on a docket. The land beneath her feet did not feel solid. It felt like a boat adrift in a dark, uncertain sea. She was about to go inside to try and get a few hours of restless sleep when she heard a sound from the road. It was the slow, familiar clop of a horse pulling a heavy wagon. Her first instinct was fear, a jolt of adrenaline that made her stand up, her hand reaching for the door. But there was something steady and unhurried about the sound, not the furtive approach of men like Brigg. The wagon pulled into her yard and stopped. In the faint starlight, she recognized the broad shoulders of Caleb Hart. He swung down from the wagon seat without a word and began to unhitch his horse. Eliza watched, bewildered, as he led the animal to her water trough in the back of the wagon. She could just make out a long, neat stack of new lumber. Good. Smooth pine planks and sturdy cedar posts. "Sheriff," she called out, her voice a little shaky. "It is late." "The law does not keep hours," he replied, his voice calm and low. He walked to the back of the wagon, and neither does a man with a project in mind. He began to unload the wood, stacking it carefully on the ground near the porch. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements sure and deliberate. He brought out a saw, a hammer, a brace and bit, and a canvas roll of other tools she did not recognize. He lit a lantern and hung it from a low-hanging branch of the cottonwood tree, casting a warm, golden circle of light in the yard. Eliza stood in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and watched him work. He started with the porch itself, prying away the blackened, fire-damaged floorboards with a crowbar. He measured the new planks with a practiced eye, his saw whispering through the wood in long, even strokes. He was not just a lawman. He was a builder, a man who knew how to make things whole again. The rhythmic, solid sound of his hammer driving nails was a deeply comforting one. It was the sound of repair, of restoration. It was the opposite of the crackling destruction of the fire, the opposite of the violent hammer blows Brigg had used to post the notice on her barn. He worked for over an hour, replacing the damaged frame and floor of the porch until it was solid and new. The fresh-cut pine smelled clean and sharp in the cool night air. When he was done, he did not stop. He took the long, smooth plank he had salvaged from the fire, the one he had mentioned before, and began to drill holes in either end. He fashioned a seat and a back, sanding the edges smooth so there would be no splinters. He was building her a porch swing. The realization settled over Eliza with a warmth that had nothing to do with the blanket she was clutching. It was such a simple, practical, and yet profoundly thoughtful act. He was not just fixing what was broken. He was adding something. He was building a place for rest in a life that had known only struggle. When he had the swing assembled, he attached 2 long, sturdy ropes and, with a grunt of effort, hoisted it up to the newly repaired porch roof beams. as he was making the final adjustments, tying off the ropes with a series of knots that looked both complex and unbreakable. Eliza stepped out of the house. Ash from the burned hay barn had settled on the porch railings, and her hand, as she steadied herself, came away with a faint gray smudge. Caleb turned, his work finished. He looked at her, then at the swing, then back to her. A small, tired smile touched his lips. He spoke softly, his voice a mix of wry humor and a deeper, more serious truth. "The banker took her land," he said, then corrected himself, or tried to, but the sheriff took her heart and built her a porch swing. A laugh escaped Eliza's lips, a startling sound in the quiet night. It was followed by a sudden, sharp sting in her eyes. She blinked back the tears. "My heart chooses for itself, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "And as for this swing, it will know which way the wind blows to find its way home." He gestured toward it. "It is meant to be used." She sat down on one side, the new wood smooth and solid beneath her. Caleb sat on the other, leaving a respectable distance between them. With a gentle push of his boot, he set the swing into a slow, easy motion. It creaked softly, a sound not of age and weariness, but of newness and promise. They swung in silence for a long time, the high plains wind whispering around them. It was a comfortable quiet, a space where words were not needed. They were two people, sitting together in the dark, on a small island of order and hope they had built themselves. "If we win tomorrow," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "what happens then?" "Then the real fight begins." He said honestly, "The judge will set a date for a full trial. Pike will bring in lawyers from Denver. But we will have time. And we will have Earl's confession. We will have your father's map. We will have the truth." "Home," she said, the word tasting strange and new on her tongue. "I have been so focused on just keeping the land, I think I forgot what it was for." "It is for this," Caleb said simply, looking not at her, but out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the starry sky. "For sitting, for watching the sun go down, for knowing you have a place to come back to." The next morning, the town of Dry Willow was buzzing with an anxious energy. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock, as people began to gather near the makeshift courthouse in the town hall. A commotion erupted in the marketplace at the other end of the street. Two drunkards, men no one recognized as locals, had started a loud, brawling fight over a card game. It was a crude and obvious diversion, a piece of theater designed by Silas Pike to create an atmosphere of chaos and to pull Caleb away from the hearing. But Pike had underestimated the town, or at least he had underestimated May. She appeared on the boardwalk of the Silver Dollar Saloon, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. "All right, you too," she boomed, her voice cutting through the noise. "The show is over. You can collect your wages from Mr. Pike on your way out of town." The two men froze, staring at her. A few of the local ranchers and storekeepers, men who had been hesitant to take a side, stepped forward, their faces hard and determined. They had seen enough. The fight dissolved as quickly as it had begun, the two hired brawlers slinking away into an alley. The town had made its choice. When Eliza arrived at the town hall, she was no longer alone. May was at her side, and a small but solid group of townspeople followed behind them. They were not a mob. They were witnesses. Inside, the room was packed. Silas Pike sat at the front with a slickly dressed lawyer, his face a mask of calm confidence. The circuit judge, a stern man with a heavy jaw, called the hearing to order. Pike's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced, painting a picture of Eliza as a negligent property owner, a public menace whose land was a tinderbox waiting to endanger the entire community. When he had finished, the judge looked at Eliza. "Ms. Rowe, do you have a response?" Before she could speak, Caleb stepped forward. "Judge, before Ms. Rowe speaks, I would like to submit this into evidence." He walked to the judge's bench and placed two documents upon it. One was Eliza's father's hand-drawn map. The other was a multi-page letter, signed at the bottom in the shaky but clear handwriting of Earl Jensen. The judge picked up the letter. The room was so quiet that the rustle of the paper seemed to echo. He read the first page, then the second, his eyebrows climbing higher on his forehead with each turn. He read the entire confession, his expression slowly changing from stern impatience to grim understanding. When he was finished, he laid the papers down and looked directly at Silas Pike. The banker's confident mask had begun to crack. "In light of this sworn statement," the judge announced, his voice booming in the small room, "this court is freezing the foreclosure proceedings and denying the petitioner's request for temporary seizure of the property." A collective gasp went through the room. A full hearing on the matter of the loan and the serious criminal allegations contained in this document will be scheduled in 10 days' time, the judge concluded. He banged his gavel, the sound sharp and final. "This hearing is adjourned." It was a victory, a temporary one, but a victory nonetheless. Pike and his lawyer stormed out, their faces thunderous. Eliza felt a wave of relief so powerful it made her knees weak. May put a steadying arm around her. As the crowd began to disperse, a small figure pushed his way through. It was Tomas, the young mail boy, his face bright with excitement. Sheriff, I found something," he said, panting. He held out a slightly crumpled envelope. "It is one of them penalty notices from the bank, for old man Hemlock's place. I was supposed to deliver it yesterday, but my pony threw a shoe. When I went to deliver it today, I saw the envelope had come unstuck. And look." He pointed a grubby finger at the envelope. "It is empty. There was never nothing in it, just a sealed-up empty envelope to scare him." Caleb took the envelope, a grim smile touching his lips. It was another piece of the puzzle, another small, ugly detail in Pike's pattern of intimidation and fraud, delivered by the most innocent of messengers. He looked over at Eliza, who was now surrounded by a small crowd of well-wishers. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, she was not walking it alone. Her gaze met his across the room, and he saw in her eyes a reflection of the same quiet, steady hope he had felt hammering nails in the dark, the hope of building something that would last. The 10 days granted by the judge stretched before them, a small, contested territory of time. It was a reprieve, not a resolution, and the air in Dry Willow was thick with a tension that was almost physical. People chose their sides not with open declarations, but with the subtle politics of a small town, a nod in the street, a shared cup of coffee, or the deliberate act of crossing the road to avoid a conversation. Eliza found herself the subject of intense scrutiny. Some looked at her with a newfound respect, others with a pity she found more insulting than scorn, and a few, loyal to Pike's money and influence, with open hostility. Caleb, for his part, was a rock of quiet professionalism. He prepared his case with methodical precision, spending long hours with Earl Jensen, whose confession grew more detailed with each retelling. He was building a wall of facts, mortared with sworn testimony, confident it would stand up in court. The weather, as if mirroring the town's mood, grew restless. The days became unnaturally warm, the sky a hazy, bleached-out blue. The wind, once a cool messenger from the mountains, turned hot and abrasive, picking up the red dust of the valley and flinging it against windows and doors. An old-timer at the general store spat a stream of tobacco juice and declared it was a weather breeder. He was right. It began late one afternoon. A strange, yellowish-brown pallor appeared on the western horizon, a bruise on the edge of the sky. The wind died down completely, creating an unnerving, expectant silence. The cattle grew restless in the pasture, their lowing uneasy. Eliza, who had spent the day weeding her small vegetable garden, felt the change in the air, a drop in pressure that made her skin prickle. She looked to the west and saw the bruise spreading, darkening, a roiling wall of dust and sand climbing toward the heavens, a sandstorm. She had just finished securing the latches on her barn and chicken coop when Caleb rode in, his horse already skittish, its ears twitching. "It is a bad one," he said, swinging down from the saddle, his eyes on the approaching wall of grit. "Figured you could use an extra hand." There was no time to argue or to feel the small, pleased flutter in her chest at his forethought. Together, they made a final check, tightening ropes on the loose tin of the barn roof, ensuring the water troughs were as full as they could be. By the time they finished, the first tendrils of the storm were upon them. The sun was blotted out. The world plunged into an eerie, orange twilight. The wind returned with a sudden, violent roar, not as a steady blow, but as a series of explosive gusts that tore at the cottonwood leaves and sent small stones skittering across the yard. The house Caleb shouted over the rising din. They ran for the small homestead, reaching the porch just as the full fury of the storm hit. It was like being inside a drum being beaten by a giant. The air was thick with sand, a suffocating cloud that made it hard to breathe and reduced visibility to a few feet. The sound was a deafening, continuous howl, 1,000 tormented voices screaming at once. They did not go inside. The small porch, with the swing he had built, felt like a ship's deck in a hurricane, a place to face the onslaught rather than hide from it. They sat on the swing, the only solid, moving thing in the chaos. The wind pushed it, making it sway in a wild, unpredictable rhythm, the new ropes groaning in protest. There was nothing to do but wait it out. Shouting was impossible, so they sat in a shared, roaring silence, two small figures against the immense, elemental rage of the landscape. In the heart of the storm, the world was reduced to this small, swaying space. As the hours passed, the storm settled into a relentless, grinding assault. The initial fury abated, but the wind and sand remained, a constant, abrasive presence. They could speak now, their voices raised to be heard over the gale. "I have never seen one this bad," Eliza said, her hair, her clothes, her very skin gritty with a fine layer of dust. "It will pass," Caleb said, his voice a low, steady rumble beside her. "They always do." The storm seemed to strip away everything but the essential. There on the swinging porch, cocooned in the wild noise, the daily pretenses and defenses felt flimsy and unnecessary. "The night my father died," Eliza said suddenly, the words pulled from a deep, guarded place. The wind sounded like this, like it was trying to pull the whole world apart. She stared out into the swirling brown darkness. He was sick for a long time. I nursed him. When he was gone, the house was so quiet. Too quiet. My mother, she hated the quiet. She hated the work. She stayed through the winter, but she was like a ghost, just a shape in the rooms. One morning in the spring, I woke up, and she was gone. Her clothes, the little money we had, just gone. She did not even leave a note. She fell silent, the confession hanging in the gritty air between them. It explained so much about her, the fierce, almost brittle independence, the way she held everyone at arm's length, the deep-seated fear of relying on anyone who might simply walk away. Caleb did not offer empty platitudes. He just listened, the swing moving in its slow, rhythmic arc. After a long moment, he spoke, his own voice rough with a memory he rarely revisited. During the war, he began, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the storm. I was young, full of fire and vinegar, thought I was invincible. We were on patrol, a small unit, deep in contested territory. We were supposed to be cautious, quiet, but I saw what I thought was a lone rider, a scout, and I saw a chance to be a hero. I broke formation, gave chase, convinced the others to follow. It was a trap, of course, a classic ambush. They were waiting for us in a ravine. His voice dropped lower. We fought our way out, but my friend, a boy from Ohio named Samuel, took a bullet in his leg. It was a bad wound. By the time we got him back to the field hospital, the infection had set in. They had to take the leg. It was my fault, my recklessness, my pride. He spent the rest of his life with a wooden leg because I wanted to be a hero for 5 minutes. He stopped, the guilt of it still fresh after all these years. It was the reason he was so deliberate now, so careful. He had learned, in the most brutal way possible, the cost of a single, impulsive mistake. They sat in silence again, their shared vulnerabilities laid bare in the heart of the storm. They were two people marked by loss and regret, each fighting their own kind of war. Eliza felt a profound shift within her. The wall she had so carefully maintained around her heart felt thin, porous. She was not just a widow fighting for her land anymore. She was a woman, sitting next to a man who understood the language of scars. Slowly, as if it had its own will, the wind began to die down. The roar softened to a mournful whistle. In the abating chaos, Caleb turned to her. His gaze was gentle, full of a quiet understanding. He looked at her right hand, which rested on her lap, the one that bore the faint, silvery trace of the burn from the barn door bolt. He reached out and took her hand in his. His touch was warm and steady. He traced the outline of the scar with his thumb, a gesture of infinite tenderness. Then he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft, gentle kiss to the scar. It was not a kiss of passion, but of healing. It was a question and an answer. It was a promise to honor the wound she carried. A shudder went through Eliza. A breath she had been holding for years seemed to leave her body. She leaned toward him, a slow, unthinking motion, and rested her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. The first kiss came as naturally as breathing. It was slow and warm, unhurried, a quiet confirmation of a choice that had already been made in the dark of night while facing down coyotes. In the shared labor of mending a fence, in the solid, steady sound of his hammer building a place for them to sit. The moment was shattered by a sound that cut through the wind's whistle. It was a sharp crack of splintering wood, followed by the panicked, terrified bawling of her cattle. They both sprang to their feet, the intimate spell broken, replaced by the instant clarity of danger.
"What was that?" Eliza cried.
"Stay here," Caleb commanded, already pulling his pistol from its holster. But she was right behind him as he leapt off the porch into the still swirling dust. The storm, while lessened, provided a perfect cover of noise and poor visibility. They ran toward the pasture, guided by the sounds of the distressed herd. They found the source of the commotion at the main water trough. It had been smashed, the wooden planks split apart by a heavy axe, the precious water draining into the thirsty ground. A shadowy figure was just disappearing into the brown gloom at the far end of the pasture. It was Brig. There was no time to give chase. The cattle, already spooked by the storm and now maddened by thirst, were beginning to bolt. A stampede in the poor visibility would be disastrous. "The rope from my saddle," Caleb yelled, and Eliza did not hesitate. She ran to his horse, which was huddled against the lee side of the barn, and fumbled with the saddle ties, her fingers clumsy with the urgency. She pulled the lariat free and ran back to him. What followed was a desperate, chaotic ballet in the dust. They worked as a team, their earlier intimacy transformed into a seamless, practical partnership. Caleb used the rope, his throws long and accurate, to head off the lead steer, turning the panicked animal back into the herd. Eliza, using her smaller size and her knowledge of the animals, moved among them, her voice a low, calming murmur, soothing their fear, guiding them away from the broken fences and toward the relative safety of the barn. Slowly, painstakingly, they brought the herd under control. When the last of the cattle were secured in the barn, they leaned against the fence, exhausted, their faces and clothes caked with a mixture of sand and mud. The storm had finally passed. The wind was now just a whisper, and a sliver of moon was visible through the clearing haze. As Caleb coiled his rope, his boot struck something metallic in the mud near the broken trough. He bent down and picked it up. It was a heavy-bladed knife, the kind used for skinning or rough camp work. Carved crudely into the wooden handle was a single, unmistakable letter, P. They walked back to the house in silence, the knife a cold, hard piece of evidence in Caleb's hand. They were covered in the grit of the storm, their shoulders aching with exhaustion. But they were together. They stepped onto the porch and looked at the swing. It hung steady and true, its new ropes holding fast, untouched by the fury that had just passed. It had weathered the storm, and so had they. The day of the trial dawned clear and unforgivingly bright. The town hall was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the smells of dust, sweat, and nervous anticipation. It was not a legal proceeding so much as a public reckoning. Eliza sat on a hard wooden bench next to Caleb, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was not the soot-stained, desperate woman who had fought coyotes in the dark. She was composed, her fear transformed into a cold, hard resolve. Across the room, Silas Pike sat beside a man in a fine wool suit, a lawyer brought in from Denver whose face wore a permanent, condescending smirk. Pike looked serene, as if he were merely a spectator at a moderately interesting play. The circuit judge, a man named Miller with a face like a weathered stone, called the court to order. The proceedings began with a slow, methodical presentation of Eliza's case. The Reverend Michael, his voice gentle but firm, presented the map Eliza's father had drawn, testifying to the character of the man who had made it and the sacred trust in which it had been kept. Thomas, the mail boy, stood on a box to see over the witness stand, his young voice piping and clear as he recounted finding the empty, sealed envelope meant for Old Man Hemlock. He held it up for the judge to see, a flimsy piece of paper that represented the casual cruelty of Pike's methods. May took the stand next, her testimony a blistering indictment of Pike's attempts to strangle Eliza's livelihood, her voice echoing with the righteous anger of a community betrayed. She was followed by Henderson, the cattle buyer, who mumbled his shamefaced admission that Pike had threatened him with financial ruin if he did business with the Rowe homestead. Then Caleb called his final witness. Earl Jensen walked to the stand with the heavy, shuffling gait of a man heading to his own execution. He did not look at Caleb, or Pike, or anyone in the crowd. He looked at the floorboards, his face a miserable shade of gray. He was sworn in, and Caleb, in a voice devoid of judgment, simply asked him to tell the court what he had done. Earl took a deep, shuddering breath and began to read from the confession he had written. His voice was a low, broken monotone, but every word fell into the silent room with the weight of a stone. He detailed the pressure from Pike, the fabricated debt, the late-night sessions in the bank. He explained, with a voice full of self-loathing, how he had stolen the notary logbook, forged the entry, and created the fraudulent addendum that had started the entire affair. When he was finished, he looked up, his eyes swimming with tears, and looked directly at Eliza. "I am sorry, Ms. Rowe," he whispered. "I was a coward." A stunned silence filled the room. The paper trail, the coercion, the forgery. It was all laid bare. But Pike's lawyer was unruffled. He rose to his feet, a thin smile on his lips. "A truly moving performance," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We have the tearful confession of a disgraced deputy attempting to save his own skin. We have the sentimental scribblings of a long-dead farmer. We have the confused story of a small boy and the saloon gossip of a woman whose primary business is selling whiskey. Judge, this is not a case. It is a pageant of rumor and innuendo." He then turned his attention to Eliza, his eyes cold and appraising. "This entire affair is a fabrication, a desperate attempt by a woman who could not manage her own affairs to defraud a respected community leader. And who has she enlisted in this scheme? None other than the town sheriff, a man who, by all accounts, has taken a very personal interest in the widow and her property." A nasty murmur rippled through the crowd. The lawyer had found the one weak point in their story, the one thing he could twist into something ugly. He was painting them not as victim and protector, but as conspirators. Eliza felt a hot flush of shame, even though she had done nothing wrong. As the lawyer continued his venomous speech, Caleb's attention was drawn to the back of the room. He saw Brig, who had been lurking near the doorway, slip outside. A moment later, he saw young Thomas, who had returned to his seat next to his mother, get up and head for the door, likely to use the outhouse. A cold knot of dread formed in Caleb's stomach. He leaned over to Eliza.
"I will be right back," he whispered. "Do not worry."
He stood and walked toward the rear of the hall, his movements calm and deliberate, drawing little attention. He stepped outside into the bright sunlight just in time to see Brig grab Thomas by the arm. His big hand clamped over the boy's mouth, dragging him toward the alley that led up the hill behind the town. Brig Caleb's voice was like the crack of a whip. Brig froze, then shoved Thomas forward, causing the boy to stumble and fall. He did not wait. He turned and ran, scrambling up the steep, dusty path that led to the old, abandoned windmill on the crest of the hill. Caleb checked on Thomas first, helping the terrified, crying boy to his feet and sending him back to his mother inside. Then he drew his pistol and started up the hill. The windmill stood like a lonely sentinel against the blue sky, its great wooden blades motionless and rotting. Brig was waiting for him at the base of the structure, using the crumbling stone foundation for cover. The first shot kicked up a cloud of dust near Caleb's feet. Caleb did not return fire. He kept moving, using the scant cover of rocks and scrub brush, closing the distance. This was not a battlefield. This was a simple matter of bringing a criminal to justice. "Give it up," Brig Caleb shouted.
"There is nowhere left to run."
"Pike pays me to finish things," Brig yelled back, his voice ragged with desperation. Another shot splintered a rock near Caleb's head. Caleb had seen enough. He waited for Brig to expose himself to fire again, and when he did, Caleb's pistol bucked once in his hand. It was not a killing shot. He was a lawman, not an executioner. The bullet struck Brig in his right hand, the one holding the gun. The pistol clattered to the ground, and Brig howled in pain, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest. Caleb was on him in a second, kicking the fallen gun away. He hauled the whimpering man to his feet. "It is over," Caleb said, his voice hard as iron. "Pike cannot help you now, but you can help yourself. Tell me everything." Defeated, in pain, and abandoned by the man who had paid him, Brig's resistance crumbled. "He paid me," he snarled, the words tumbling out between groans of pain. "Told me to scare her off, burn the hay, break the trough. Said she would run. Said he wanted the whole creek, all the way down the valley." Back in the courtroom, the judge, annoyed by the disruption and the sheriff's sudden absence, had called a 1-hour recess. The room buzzed with speculation. Pike's lawyer was preening, convinced he had won. Eliza sat alone, a cold fear creeping back into her heart. The doors of the town hall banged open. Caleb stood there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. He was dusty, his sleeve was torn, and he was half dragging a wounded, bleeding Brig behind him. He marched his prisoner to the front of the room and deposited him in a heap before the judge's bench. "Judge Miller," Caleb said, his voice clear and ringing. "Court may be in recess, but the law is not." He placed the heavy knife with the P carved into the handle on the bench. "This man, Barton Brig, has just confessed. He has confessed to the arson at the Rowe homestead and to the destruction of property during the sandstorm. He has confessed that he was acting on the direct orders of that man right there, Silas Pike." He pointed a finger at Pike. The banker's face had gone from confident to shocked, to the color of old parchment. His mask did not just crack, it shattered. The judge stared from the knife to the cowering Brig, to the suddenly shrunken figure of Silas Pike. He looked at Earl Jensen's confession, which still lay on his bench. He looked at Eliza, sitting straight and silent. Then he picked up his gavel. He reconvened the court. His voice was a thunderclap in the silent room. Based on the evidence presented, and this new, corroborated testimony, he declared, "This court finds that the addendum to the loan agreement of the Rowe homestead is a fraudulent document, and is therefore null and void. The terms of the loan shall revert to the original agreement." He paused, looking at some figures in a ledger, according to which Ms. Rowe has only 2 payments remaining. A wave of applause started at the back of the room and swept forward. The judge banged his gavel for silence. Furthermore, he continued, his eyes like chips of granite, "A review of recent land acquisitions shows that Mr. Pike has been systematically buying up properties along the entire length of Willow Creek, a clear attempt to monopolize the water resources of this valley, in light of the credible accusations of forgery, coercion, arson, and conspiracy. I am ordering the assets of Silas Pike and the Pike and Company Bank to be frozen, pending a full criminal investigation." He pointed the gavel at Pike and Brigg. "Deputy, take these men into custody." 2 lawmen who had come with the judge moved forward. Pike stood as if in a trance, his face a ruin of disbelief. He was a man who had believed himself above the law, and the law had just fallen on him like a mountain. The judge then looked at Earl Jensen. "For your cooperation with this court, your sentence will be lenient, but you are dismissed from your duties as a peace officer, effective immediately." Eliza watched it all unfold, not with triumph, but with a profound, quiet stillness. It was over. The fight was done. The crowd was on its feet, a chaotic scene of celebration and relief. Caleb walked over to her, his face weary but calm. The noise of the room seemed to fade away, leaving them in a small pocket of silence. She looked at him, her eyes full of a gratitude too deep for words. "The land has its voice now," he said simply, and in the quiet space between them, she knew he was right. It was not her voice, or his, that had won. It was the truth of the water, the ink and the soil itself, a truth that could not be burned, or forged, or silenced. In the aftermath of the trial, a strange quiet descended upon Dry Willow. It was the quiet of a fever that had broken, leaving the patient weary but on the road to healing. The Pike and Company Bank was closed. A notice from the federal marshal tacked to its polished oak door. Silas Pike and Brigg were gone, taken to the county jail to await a trial whose outcome was a foregone conclusion. The town, having held its breath for so long, seemed to exhale all at once. A week later, Eliza sat in the office of a lawyer Caleb had recommended, a plain-speaking man from the county seat. She signed a new loan agreement, the terms fair and the language clear. With the new court-appointed receiver of the bank, the judge, in his final ruling, had also awarded her a settlement for damages, a sum that was enough to cover the cost of the burned hay, the destroyed trough, and to buy new seed for the spring planting. The paper she signed was not just a legal document, it was an affirmation. It was the deed to her own life, signed in her own name, clear and unburdened. The following Saturday, she was woken not by the sun, but by the sound of voices and the rumble of wagon wheels in her yard. She looked out her window and saw a sight that made her heart catch in her throat. A dozen of her neighbors were in her yard, armed not with weapons, but with shovels, hammers, and saws. May was directing the whole operation from the seat of a buckboard, a veritable general deploying her troops. Henderson, the cattle buyer, was there, his face still sheepish, leading a team to clear the charred debris of the hay barn. The Reverend Michael was helping 2 other men construct a new, sturdy water trough. Even some of the women who had once whispered about her were there, carrying baskets of food. It was a barn raising without the barn, a community's quiet apology and its loud declaration of support. They were rebuilding what their fear and silence had allowed to be broken. Eliza pulled on her boots and went outside, not as a victim to be helped, but as a neighbor, ready to work alongside them. All day they labored under the warm Colorado sun. the air filled with the sounds of construction and easy, forgiving laughter. May, true to form, had brought a massive cast-iron pot, and by midday, the smell of a rich beef stew filled the air, a scent of fellowship and sustenance. Late in the afternoon, young Tomas arrived, his face beaming with pride. He was carrying a newly carved wooden sign, in simple, burned-in letters. It read, Row Homestead. He and Caleb nailed it to the gatepost, replacing the splintered, weathered board that had hung there for a generation. It was a new beginning. As the sun began to dip low, casting long, golden fingers of light across the valley, the work was done, the yard was clear, the trough was full, and the fences were mended. One by one, the neighbors packed their tools, shared a final word with Eliza, and headed for home, leaving behind a profound sense of peace and order. Eliza and Caleb were left alone in the quiet twilight. Standing on the porch he had repaired, the air was cool and sweet with the scent of freshly cut pine and the lingering aroma of maize stew. "I do not know how to thank them," Eliza said, her voice soft. "You already did," Caleb replied. "By staying, by fighting, you reminded them of who they are supposed to be." They were quiet for a moment, and then Eliza gestured to the porch swing. They sat, a comfortable silence settling between them as they began to move in a slow, gentle rhythm. The day was done. The long battle was over. This, she thought, was what peace felt like. Caleb looked out at the new sign on the gatepost, then at the sturdy lines of the rebuilt fences, then at her. "I did not take your heart, Eliza," he said, his voice a low, simple statement of fact. "You put it on this seat the day we hung it." A slow, genuine smile spread across Eliza's face, a smile that reached her eyes and made them shine in the fading light. "Then we will watch over it together," she said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was not a letter. It looked official, legal. He handed it to her. "What is this?" she asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Read it," he said. She unfolded the paper. It was a legal deed, drawn up by the lawyer in the county seat. It was a formal petition to the Territorial Water Board, combining the water rights of his small property on the edge of town with hers. But it was more than that. It was also a last will and testament, a document of inheritance, a legal binding of two lives into one. At the top of the page, in the lawyer's neat script, were the words, "The estate of Roe Hart." Her breath caught. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. This was his proposal. Not a diamond ring, which spoke of ownership, but a legal document, which spoke of partnership. Not a flowery promise, but a practical, binding contract for a shared future. It was the most honest and the most romantic thing she had ever seen. He did not say a word. He just looked at her, his heart in his eyes, waiting. "Caleb Hart," she said, her voice a little shaky, a single tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She folded the paper carefully and held it to her chest. "We started with fairness. Now, we can call it love." He reached over and took her hand, the one with the silvery scar, and his fingers laced with hers. And on the porch he had built, they sat together on the swing, watching the last of the light fade from the sky as the first stars began to appear. The next season, the early summer rains came, soft and steady, washing the last of the red dust from the air and turning the pastures a vibrant, hopeful green. The waters of Willow Creek ran full and clear, spilling into the high water channel and nourishing the land, just as her father had known they would. In the small orchard, the apricot trees burst into a cloud of fragrant white blossoms, a promise of the sweet harvest to come. And on the porch of the Roe Hart homestead, the swing creaked with a gentle, rhythmic sound, a constant, quiet conversation with the wind. The story of what had happened became a part of the town's own story, a piece of local lore told on cool evenings and in the warm confines of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The tale would change a little with each telling, as such stories do. But the heart of it always remained the same. People would nod and say, "The banker tried to take her land, but the sheriff took her heart and built her a porch swing." It became a quiet legend, a gentle reminder that justice, like a well-built house, needs a solid foundation, and that love is not about grand gestures, but about the simple, steady act of building a place to sit together and weather the storm. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.